On a moonlit night on the Orcadian island of Orkney, a farmer named Thomas was walking home along a narrow coastal road. The sea was on one side, a freshwater loch was on the other. The road behind him was no shorter than the road ahead, and something was coming. Thomas was known on the island as a man who did not back down. Rough and ready, they said of him, not the type to run from a fight. So when he saw the shape coming toward him on the road, he squared his shoulders and stood his ground. He had no other options. The thing coming toward him had already closed off the road behind him. There was nowhere to go. He stood and he waited and he watched it come. And as it drew close enough to see clearly, Thomas understood why no one on Orkney said its name out loud unless they had to. Why no one described it in detail unless pressed. Why Walter Traill Dennison, the folklorist who eventually coaxed this story from him, needed much higgling and persuasion before Thomas would speak of it at all, even decades after the night it happened. The Nuckelavee had found him on the road. And now it was almost close enough to touch. The name Nuckelavee translates from the older Orcadian, Nuckelavee, as devil of the sea. Dennison, who spent years collecting the folklore of Orkney in the late 19th century, found it the hardest legend to document. Few people would name it, fewer still would describe it. At a distance, it could be mistaken for a rider on horseback. Up close, that reading dissolved into something the human mind struggled to process. It had no skin. Anywhere on its body, across its entire surface, there was no skin. Black blood moved through yellow veins. Red muscle worked directly against the open air. The human part, the torso that rose from the horse's back with no hips, no waist, no point of junction that looked like it belonged, had a head roughly 3 feet across that rolled on its neck as if it might tumble off at any moment. The arms hung so long they dragged on the ground without bending. The horse part had fin-like appendages growing from its legs and a single red eye burning in its skull. Thomas described it thus: like an oversized horse with a massive, misshapen man either riding on its back or as part of its back. I could not tell. Whether it was one terrible beast or two, I could not tell. The Nuckelavee lives in the sea. It is a creature of salt water. The sea sustains it. The sea is its home. And when it comes ashore, it brings the sea's indifference to human survival with it. Dennison's own words: the Nuckelavee was a monster of unmixed malignity, never willingly resting from doing evil to mankind. Not hunger, not territory, not self-defense. Unmixed malignity, evil as a resting state, destruction as a default condition. On the island of Stronsay in 1722, islanders began burning seaweed to produce soda ash. The smoke was pungent and thick, and it spread across the water. And, according to Orcadian tradition, it enraged the Nuckelavee, who considered the burning a desecration of the sea. What followed was the Mortasheen epidemic, a horse disease of documented historical reality that swept through Stronsay and spread to every other island involved in the kelp industry. The horses died, the livestock died, the crops failed. Science would later attribute the mortality to disease transmission. Neither framework fully explains why the epidemic began when it did, spread where it spread, and stopped when it stopped. The Nuckelavee does not come ashore whenever it chooses. The Orcadian tradition understood this, understood that something so malevolent operating at that scale required a counterforce to keep it in check. That counterforce is the Mither of the sea, an older spirit than the Nuckelavee itself, a figure of the deep water who holds dominion over the sea through the summer months and whose strength keeps the Nuckelavee confined. She does not destroy it, she contains it. As summer fades and her strength wanes with the spread of autumn, her grip loosens, and the Nuckelavee comes ashore. The universe, in this tradition, takes the Nuckelavee seriously enough to appoint a guardian against it. That is perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. Not the anatomy, not the breath, not the unmixed malignity, but the implication that the Nuckelavee is permanent, that it will always exist, that the best the world can do is contain it for half the year and endure it for the other half. Orkney sits at the seam of two old worlds. The Norse ruled the islands for centuries, leaving their language and their gods half dissolved into local soil. Beneath that lay older Celtic stories, water horses, creatures that lived in lochs and dragged the unwary down. The folklorist Ernest Marwick believed the Nuckelavee was a Norse sea demon, the Nook, fused with one of those Celtic water horses and warped by island isolation into something neither tradition would fully claim. A creature stitched together from two mythologies at the point where they collided. The seams showed. Back on the road, the Nuckelavee is close enough now that Thomas can see the black blood moving through the yellow veins, close enough that the breath reaches him, hot, foul, wrong. The road behind him is no shorter than the road ahead, so he steps sideways. His foot catches the edge of the loch and kicks water onto the foreleg of the horse part of the Nuckelavee. The creature recoils, it rears, it screams, and Thomas runs. He clears a rivulet of fresh running water and collapses on the far bank. The Nuckelavee draws up at the water's edge, unable to cross. It reaches out and snatches Thomas's bonnet from his head as he leaps. It keeps the bonnet and went back to the sea and waited. Walter Traill Dennison spent years collecting the folklore of Orkney. He documented giants and trows and selkies and sea spirits of every description. But the Nuckelavee was different. People would not name it freely. They would not describe it in detail. The Nuckelavee is a creature of unmixed malignity that lives in the sea, comes ashore when the Mither of the sea's strength fails, withers crops and spreads plague, cannot be fought, cannot be reasoned with, and can only be survived by luck and the geography of fresh water. The Orcadian islanders lived with this understanding for centuries. They burned seaweed and paid for it in dead horses. They walked coastal roads at night and kept one eye on the loch. They spoke the name only when they had to. Thomas escaped with his life. The Nuckelavee kept his hat and went back to the sea and waited. This is episode 4A of Sister Legends. Episode 4B travels to the other side of the world, to Arnhem Land in Australia's Northern Territory, where another tradition has lived alongside something vast and dangerous in the water for tens of thousands of years. That tradition does not hide from what lives in the water. It does not escape it by luck and geography. It approaches the water's edge and announces itself to what lives there. It sings. Same fears, different shores.